Welkom in de Fikfak Special van 24 augustus, want ik ben even in het buitenland en dat is niet te combineren met Fikfak Nieuws, want er kruipt serieus wat werk in. Dank u wel voor uw begrip. Maar vandaag dus een special die u zal doen nadenken, denk ik. Ik ben altijd onder de indruk geweest van Gabor Maté. Dat is een 80-jarige Hongaars-Canadese arts, een bestsellerschrijver ook, een man die al jaren gespecialiseerd is in traumabehandeling. In een eerste stukje vertelt hij over de impact van het emotioneel systeem op onze gezondheid en op ons immuunsysteem.
Love is supposed to be a two-way valve. It's supposed to flow in both directions. When it only flows towards others and you ignore your own needs, then you're taking on way too much stress in this life, and it's going to tell on your health. So nothing wrong with loving others. We're meant to do that. But when we're loving others by chronically suppressing our own needs, where we are always afraid of disappointing others, where our own needs are compulsively ignored, that's a quick route to disease. When something happens emotionally, it's going to have impact on the immune system as well. So the people that suppress themselves emotionally because they're programmed to do so, not because it's their fault, but because that's how they survived their childhoods, it then follows that if you change that relationship to yourself, you can have an impact on that process that the disease represents. And that's what I believe is actually going on. It's a process, it's not a thing, it doesn't have a life of its own necessarily. I'm not saying everything is curable, it's just not that simple, but it is a process, and insofar as you change what goes into that process, you can have significant influence on that process in many cases. And you can certainly prevent it from coming on by understanding this.
Veel van ons gedrag, waar je moeite mee hebt, waar je mee worstelt, de pijn die je soms meedraagt, dat kun je volgens Gabor Maté terugbrengen tot onze kinderjaren. En de ontwikkelingstrauma's die daarmee gepaard gaan. De effecten van die trauma's op onze mentale en lichamelijke gezondheid nu als volwassenen. Een onderwerp dat mij geweldig boeit eigenlijk, gezien ik als kind ook geconfronteerd werd met de dood van mijn moeder toen ik 9 jaar was. En de wetenschap dat mijn karakter daardoor gevormd werd. Gabor Maté over ontwikkelingstrauma's.
So the actual meaning of the word trauma is a wound. That's the Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is a physical or a psychological wounding. So what causes that wounding? What causes that wounding is either when bad things happen that shouldn't have happened, such as happened to a lot of people, sexual abuse in childhood, emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, an emotionally very unsafe family environment in the midst of a divorce or family conflict, violence in the family, a parent being addicted, a parent being jailed, a parent dying, neglect. These are very wounding experiences for young children. Very wounding. But there's another way you can wound people as well, which is not just by doing bad things to them that shouldn't have happened, but by not giving them the needs, not giving them what they need. So children can be wounded by being hurt in the ways that I talked about, but they can also be wounded if their essential needs for human development are not met. A lot of families where there's no overt trauma as such, children are still wounded because they're not seen for who they are, not accepted for who they are, not valued for who they are. When there's pressures on them to be different other than the way they are, that can also wound children. Needs of children are for unconditional loving acceptance in the context of a secure relationship where the child doesn't have to work to make the relationship work. The acceptance and the regard should be unconditional. You can take an acorn and you can say that it's the nature of the acorn to become a mighty oak tree, which it is. But is that going to happen automatically? If I put that acorn on my desk, will it ever become an oak tree? Never. Because for healthy development of that acorn, certain conditions need to be met. The same thing is true for human development. So for the brain to develop properly, you need the right environment. Now, the human brain develops, I'm quoting a scientific article from Harvard now, the human brain develops from conception into adulthood. So brain development begins in the womb, continues into adulthood. And it needs the right conditions. Just like the oak tree needs the right conditions for it to reach its stature. The essential condition for healthy brain development is a non-stressed environment, beginning in the womb. So you can stress pregnant animals in a laboratory or pregnant women in real life, and their offspring will be more likely to be addicted later on in life, because that stress interferes with healthy brain development. So when this trauma happens and the parents are not able to provide those conditions, those brains don't develop the way they should. In fact, they develop in ways that predispose them to addiction. When people do opiates, it's because they have too much pain in their lives. They need soothing of the pain. They're lacking pleasure and reward and joy. And they're looking for the warmth of love. And that's why a heroin addicted patient of mine once told me, "Doc, when I do heroin, it feels like a warm, soft hug." In other words, when you tell me that you're an opiate addict, you're telling me that early in your childhood, you didn't have the love you needed, you sustained too much pain, and you lacked pleasure and joy. And when you did that opiate chemical for the first time, you felt like a normal human being for the first time. That's what you just told me. That's my understanding. The second thing I say to parents is, work on your own issues. Because any traumas that you haven't worked out in yourself, almost inevitably, you're going to pass it on to your kids, like I did. These things that I'm talking about now, I didn't know them when I was a young parent. And there was significant traumas that my wife had, that I had, that we haven't even realized yet. So that it's almost inevitable that parents who are not conscious will pass on their traumas to their kids. So work on your own issues. Really important. Number 3, children have certain needs. In my new book, The Myth of Normal, I have a chapter on the irreducible needs of children. Those needs include unconditional loving acceptance, the capacity to experience all their emotions, whether they're anger or joy or pain. Those emotions need to be received. In other words, the question you have to start off with as a parent is, what are the needs that my children have for healthy development? Both in this book, The Myth of Normal, and in a previous parenting book I wrote called Hold On To Your Kids, you have to start off not with what do we want our kids to be or how do we want them to behave, but what are their needs for healthy development? And in this modern society, parents are really challenged to meet those needs. Let's imagine you're an adult in a relationship.
Right.
And what if your partner said to you, every time you feel anger, I'm going to make you go to your room and sit by yourself. How would that feel to you as an adult? Now, as a child, you're completely dependent on the parent. And in fact, you have this absolute need to belong to the parent and to be close to them, to be attached to them. When we say to a child, if you're angry, you have to separate from me, what you're saying to the child is, if you have a genuine feeling like anger, you can't have the relationship with me. I'm going to deprive you of what you need. In other words, we create a fear-based relationship with the child. No child develops properly under conditions of fear. And so the more connection you have with the child, by the way, the more the child will want to do what you want them to do.
What are some signs or symptoms like in adulthood that maybe somebody needs to go back and look into some of their trauma and heal from it?
It's very common for adults to recognize that something isn't working and therefore go back and what happened here. That was my case. I was a successful medical doctor. I had children. I was married. I was a respected member of the community, but I wasn't happy. I was depressed. And my children were actually afraid of me. And I had to ask myself, what's going on here? So trauma, what we have to understand here is that trauma is not what happened to you. That's not what the trauma is. So trauma wasn't that there was neglect or divorce or bullying or abuse. That's not the trauma. That's the traumatic event. The trauma is the wound that you sustained as a result. So I'll give you a very personal example. When I was a year old, my mother gave me to a total stranger in the street to save my life. This was in Budapest, Hungary, Second World War. So I didn't see my mom, for 5 or 6 weeks. That was a traumatic event. The trauma was the wound that I came to believe that I wasn't wanted. When your mother gives you to a stranger and you don't see her for 5 or 6 weeks, what else can you conclude as a 1-year-old? That you're not wanted, you're not lovable. Natural conclusion for the child. The wound was not that I was given to the stranger. The wound was the impact, what happened inside me, that I wasn't lovable. So, 40 years later, 35 years later, I'm a parent, but I don't believe I'm lovable. So I become a workaholic doctor. so people will love me. I'm always available, day or night. Beeper's always on, delivering babies, going to emergency wards, looking after dying people. Because I'm still trying to prove to myself that I'm lovable, that my life is worth something. What is the impact of my children? Daddy's always busy, he's never available. Work is more important to him. The impact on my children is they get the message they're not lovable. So at some point, you have to start asking yourself, why am I behaving the way I'm behaving? When my partner doesn't look at me the right way, why do I feel so hurt? When the work that I'm doing is not satisfying me, why am I doing work that doesn't satisfy me? When I get an illness, like sometimes disease wakes people up. If I get an autoimmune disease, which women, by the way, get in much higher numbers than men do, we can talk about why. Or when I get depression, or let's say I have an addiction, what am I trying to run away from? So usually we have to suffer a little bit, or a lot actually, before we start asking the right questions. I wish we weren't like that as human beings, but you know what? I was like that. I didn't start asking the right questions until I realized I was suffering and I was creating suffering for others. Why? That's when the exploration begins.
Wat een ongelooflijk wijze mens is dat toch. In feite komt het er eigenlijk op neer dat wij het gebrek aan liefde dat we ervaarden in onze kindertijd de rest van ons leven proberen te compenseren, tenzij dat je het echt aanpakt. Ik eindig altijd het Fikfak nieuws graag met dieren, omdat ze dikwijls grappig zijn, omdat ze plezier hebben en omdat ze authentiek zijn. En ik denk dat dat in de toekomst voor de mens ook een belangrijke waarde zal worden. Het is fascinerend, omdat dieren dikwijls ook gewoon een spiegel zijn van ons eigen gedrag. Volgende week is er weer een normale Fikfak, met de waanzin van de week. Dankjewel nog maar eens voor uw steun. Volgende week ben ik ook een jaar bezig. En dat doen de mensen nadenken. Over het voortbestaan, over het nut ervan en over de toekomst. Heeft het zin? Om als een soort Don Quixote letterlijk tegen de windmolens in te gaan, moeten er meer Don Quixotes komen of trek ik mij terug? Ik weet het nog niet goed. Het zijn allemaal vragen die in mijn hoofd spoken. Maar ik zie uw feedback graag tegemoet. In ieder geval, tot volgende week.